Well, Lola Woetzel, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It is a pleasure to have you with us. And for our audience, I want to take a minute for those who may not know you, just to tell a little bit about your stellar and impeccable background. Dr. Lola Woetzel is a founder and partner at Global6, senior partner emeritus at McKinsey & Co., former director, McKinsey Global Institute, and visiting professor of global China studies and business at NYU in Shanghai. And Lola is an expert on urban development, economic master planning, and sustainability. She's worked with local and national governments in Asia, Middle East, Africa, Europe for more than 40 years and helping them to figure out how to best attract foreign direct investment, domestic and foreign investment, and to deliver on environmental and social goals. And her focus and her passion sits around sustainable infrastructure, commercial revitalization, affordable housing. And yeah, she's passionate about humanity, and we live in precarious times. And Lola, you have spent a great part of your effort at Global6 in making lives better and the future more promising. Why don't we kick off with a bit of an introduction about Global6 and what you're doing and at the moment? And at the same time, from your vantage point of view, being in China, seeing the metamorphosis of China, and trying to bring some of those learnings to Middle East or West Asia, as we call it, with everything that is happening in the region, what are the prospects for sustainable development as another war breaks out in that part of the world?
Well, thank you, Ollie and Anusha. It was a pleasure. I'm glad to have this chance to chat always. I'm speaking to you, of course, from Shanghai, my home, for the last 40 years. And in fact, from beyond that, my father was born here and my grandparents came here in 1926. So I really do identify as Shanghainese. It's a very distinct kind of nationality, but one which I think will be very popular in the future. Anyway, Global6. So Global6 is an urban advisory firm, and there are 8 billion people on the planet, give or take. Two are above, six are below what I will call the empowerment line. It's not the poverty line. It's the line above which you can participate in society. You have a roof over your head, savings in the bank. And the thesis is that urban development is necessary to get over the line. There are 6 billion people on the planet who currently are not over the line. By introducing urban development projects at scale, we can help them. Global6 is about planning, financing, and executing those projects at scale for the Global 6. So that's the mission. And we seek geographies where we can find leadership, resources, and a felt need for change. Those three things coming together allows us to operate at scale. And as I said, we're essentially advisory. So this builds on my background and heritage from what I did at McKinsey and the firm for decades. And I just very much I get meaning out of the work, and I like to think that it has a lot of impact. So that's the mission. So.
Fantastic. And where do you see in the context of what's happening in West Asia and Middle East at the moment, how some of these big ambitious plans will see the light in light of the crisis that is taking place in the past, 72 hours? What are the prospects for the region's development in your view in context of what's happening?
Well, I think the projects that I am typically involved in operate on a time scale of decades, if not centuries. So, cities and urban developments are some of the longest lived. In fact, they are the longest lived objects that man creates. They predate us individually. They define our collective existence, and they will be here long after we're all gone. And so the work goes on. This is a short version. There may be interruptions in it, but the underlying structural forces that drive urbanization, which I would argue are the same that drive the progress of humanity more generally, will continue. Either that or we have bigger problems to worry about, such as the end of us. But it would lift up your hearts. We should be optimists because what's the point of being something else? And in that context, continue to look for the opportunities. So I don't view anything in the last 72 hours as having fundamentally changed the nature of humanity. In fact, it has confirmed it in many unfortunate ways.
Uh, Lola, I'm going to throw you a left field question. Uh, I've been hearing discussions about the impact of global warming on melting ice caps and sea rises, and I'm sure you know better than anyone how much of humanity is actually sitting on coastlines in pretty strategic places. So when you're looking at urban development, do you take much note of potential 50, 100 years developments? Somebody was saying that, well, we just put walls around places, but I can't imagine that being a particularly effective or efficient way of protecting urban environments.
No, but it's a good place to start. No, I think that the commitments that have been made to address the issue of climate change are notable in their lack of care for the human consequences of climate change. In fact, if we all actually took this seriously, we would be spending a lot more money on putting walls around things, or hardening our infrastructure, or avoiding the next wave of heat stroke victims. And the fact that we collectively failed to deliver on our pledges around adaptation is an indictment of our common humanity. So I would vote for a bit more adaptation spending in the very short term.
Mm,
That said, I mean, I think historically, the human response to bad weather and to conditions that are intolerable is to migration. So, that is in fact, of course, the history of our planet, which is well, a history of our humanity, which is a very recent history. And when you're talking about something about climate change, it's important to recognize that this is really not about the health of the planet. The planet has been around for 6 billion years. Humanity as an organized species that says things has probably been around for no more than 50,000 years, if that, maybe 10,000
mm,
years. So the planet will be here for a long time. We may be going away.
mm,
And the difference between us going away and not going away is both how well we adapt to the things that we have done to our environment and our decision to continue to allow those things to happen or not.
mm,
So those are two decisions which are fully in our capability to make to take. If I conclude your come back to your point about coastlines and urbanization, it would be a mistake to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to simply say that, well, because things are warming, we can't have cities or coastline. And I said no. The point is not to have sustainable cities, but to have sustainable, thriving, great cities, cities that actually help develop human potential. And in that context, it's quite possible to do a heck of a lot to adapt our cities to the changing environment we have seen up to a point. So you can kill a city with through climate. The Mayan Empire will speak to you on that, or sunken cities in the Mediterranean. But yeah, I mean, you don't have to go there. Obviously, a place like Venice has had quite a lot of experience in sort of coping with this, and that's just getting started. Ahmedabad in India was the first city to have a heating plan, or a cooling plan, actually. Sorry, it's the reverse. So, yeah, I think all around the world, we're starting to see cities sort of, be the ones in the front line because they are the ones who are accountable
mm.
to their people for keeping them healthy in the face of what we're doing.
Right. Do you think creatures of the 21st century ourselves are that adaptable? In the past, I mean, we have, taking your time frame, so many cities, which, as you suggested, have just literally been vacated or just been left to vanquish. Do you think in today's world we can do that? I mean, before all this chaos in West Asia, Persian Gulf, Iran's president was talking about vacating the capital because it was not sustainable. You're talking about 10 million people. And when you look at the consequences of this war on coastal cities like Doha, like Dubai, like Abu Dhabi, like Kuwait City, chaos of war, as well as these other forces, surely may lead to mass movement, not migration, but mass movement. But these cities have billions and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure in them. Do you think humanity is ready to just pack its bags and move on from these places in ways that it did several thousand years ago?
Well, extremely unlike. The short answer is no. I mean, again, we sort of like the scale of it all. So the grand cities of Gilgamesh and Ur
Mm,
had 10,000 people. So,
right.
we got up to 1 million by about 2,000 years ago in Rome and Chang'an. Those were the mega cities of their day, and we didn't get past 1 million for quite some time. I think London sort of takes it at some point, and some Chinese cities get up to 2 million or 3 million. And it's been in the last 50 years or so where we really started to hit what we now call a mega city, which is a city with over 10 million of population. And so now we had, for a long time, Tokyo as the reigning champion at 20 something million. And now, most recently, of course, the United Nations has gone to what we call a morphological definition of city, which is simply say contiguous density. And if you take that look, you sort of ignore the administrative lines, then Jakarta tops the scale at somewhere in the 50 millions. So yeah, we're getting a lot bigger. And in that context, no. So these things don't move. They may decline. They may, become less important because, and there's a dynamic to that, which you can talk about. But no, we haven't really seen that. And and I'm afraid that sort of pronouncements from the top of the house saying this will happen when faced with urban reality and the longer term structural trends generally results in people cautiously forgetting about what they said in the future. So yeah, I'm a believer in what you can see with your own eyes and over time. And what we see from the planetary perspective is a rush towards what I'll call the archipelagos of light. That it's very poetic. If you view the Earth from outer space, it would be blank and dark for billions of years, and then suddenly the lights would come on, and they would not come on everywhere. They would come on in certain very well-defined spaces, typically around water, with reasonable agricultural land, with a stable climate to the extent that that's relevant. So yeah, and therefore not everywhere. And then once we get there, we tend to grow. There are tremendous economies of scale and even more importantly, productivity benefits from growing in place. So yeah, I think that's the story here.
I I really like the way the conversation went because my next question was that when you started telling us about your hero's journey, you said you grew up in Shanghai, and I think nobody has seen it close and personal about the transformation and metamorphosis of China at large, better than
Mhm.
you, and Shanghai. And when we talk about that 6 billion and the infrastructure deficit gap for that matter in many parts of this, aspiring population around the world, what do you think is the end game in terms of bridging that gap from the Western hemisphere in terms of budgetary pressures, innovation, products that are affordable in the global south and or the global six, we should call it as of today. Where do you think that is going? Global six is better, I think. I will start using that term. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is population is the centricity of everything we are talking about. And I love the examples you gave from Gilgamesh to the today. What is China's game in the productivity and reproduction and the erosion of its population in terms of demographics, Lola? Do you see China in 2050 having an immigration plan openly, like other parts of the world, like Australia, like America or Canada? Where does that come to play? So two questions. One, who's going to bridge that deficit gap for the global six? And China's how do you say, solution to its demographic challenges?
Well, those are great questions. And see, both of you throw multiple questions at me. So the first of all, I want to say, I like the fact that you're differentiating between Western Asia and Middle East. That this is this is I've recently realized this that the phrase the Middle East is a colonialist holdover, which sort of is a very London-centric view of the world. And so why should we be like that? I mean, these days I would just call it the region, and everybody seems to understand. And in the same way, I really like the idea that we can substitute the Global Six for the Global South, because it is true the Global Six is not exclusively in the Global South. While there may be a majority of it in the less developed countries, I find plenty of members of the Global Six in Los Angeles, London, Paris, Berlin, you name it. Folks who are not empowered, folks who don't have a roof over their head, and the solutions that they need are every much as real as the solutions that are needed in sub-Saharan Africa. And in many cases, they may be the same solution because we're actually talking about quite similar income levels, even though costs might be quite different, which is sort of a more complicated context. But on the two questions, how to bridge the infrastructure and gap analyses. Well, here I will give you my Chinese view of the world, which is that the only people who will bridge the infrastructure gap in a given place are the people in that place. No one is going to do it for them. No one is coming to rescue you. This is the conundrum, if you will, of development. People who say they have been left behind say, I don't even know how to start, where to go. So, okay, there's probably a role for human capital transfer. So when China started its modernizations, it framed what it called the economic opening to the outside world, not as the search for capital, but rather as the search for technology, most importantly, management, and then capital. And in fact, capital in very sparing amounts, and with quite a lot of restrictions on it. But the most important thing was technology, as their attitude was simply show us how to fish, and then we'll go do the rest. We will, and so for the vast majority of LDCs and kind of societies, their essential work starts at home to strengthen their domestic institutions, to boost their savings rates, to institute a predictable, transparent environment which allows for transactions to happen, essentially to build social trust. And without the trust, there's not going to be any development. And even if there is development, it's not going to last very long. So that, I would argue, is the first thing. As to, with the amount of time, well, yeah, can you do this? Of course you can. Of course. I mean, technology is driving down cost and learning curves every day. We've seen the automotive revolution, mobility revolution. We've seen the energy revolution. We will see the agricultural revolution. We've seen part of it, and we'll see more with bio. We'll see the pharma and healthcare revolution. Costs are going to continue to come down, and of course, China will be a huge part of it. Not the only one, but it'll be a big driver. So, and finally, we have more than enough money. This is typically referred to as the infrastructure dilemma, where there are trillions and trillions of unmet need and trillions of institutional capital sitting in, Toronto or somewhere else looking for a home, and never the twain shall meet. Well, I mean, again, the reason that everybody will say from the money side is that, well, it's not bankable. Which is another way of saying the costs are too high. My discount rate doesn't allow me to do this because you guys look too risky. And from that point of view, again, the answers are the same. So, like, you need to turn this into a place where that risk is no longer as apparent to outsiders. We need to have a solid basis for sustained economic development, and that will take you mobilizing your own savings to start with. It's like the only capital you can truly rely on initially is your own. So that would be my first answer. And as far as the second answer on China, well, that's a great question. There's a lot going around on, China's going to get old before it gets rich, and that's technically true, yes. China's demographics have already passed the Lewis turning point. There are more people exiting the Chinese workforce than are entering the Chinese workforce. So, In that context, you will have one of three options. Work longer, work smarter, or reduce your expectations.
Mm.
So the nobody likes to reduce their expectations. Fortunately, Chinese people's expectations are moderate. I would say the whole generation, which has been raised to be happy that it had food, but the next generation has rising expectations. So let's not count on that. Um, could they work longer? Yeah, sure. China has life expectancy in the 80s now. And during COVID, China had higher life expectancy than the United States, which is mostly due to the US falling down on itself. But still, it's very impressive what they are able to do. And so one should reasonably expect, and we already start to see this, extensions of the working time in one's life. And then we also have to ask ourselves, really, what does work anyway? If it's a structured way of earning income, yeah, sure, everybody's working right up until their 70s, and people are doing things. But actually, the big takeaway, of course, is productivity growth, and that will depend on working smarter, and that, of course, is why China loves AI, loves automation, loves dark factories, dark kitchens, dark anything. So basically each and every Chinese person has to become 4 times as productive as they are today, and that's not going to happen without a whole lot of automation. And the good news for China, of course, is they're doing that. And so that, I think, is the one big implication, is that we will see a lot of that. Two is, yes, you're absolutely right. We will have a multi-generational challenge here, and sooner or later we'll run out of people in a big way. And so, like you've seen in Japan, there will be sort of arguments about immigration, and then you'll hear pushbacks against immigration. And so, I think these societies will all have to wrestle with how that works out for them. Right now, the immigration position is pretty clear. It's all about talent, and specifically scientific talent, and that's welcomed, and others are pretty much not. So let's see how that goes. And then finally, I think the last implication is capital markets and a financial allocation system which is able to preserve generational equity. So we have the money today. In fact, we have way more than we need today. We will need it all back in 30 years or so. So how to make sure that the money is still there in 30 years is a challenge for the financial system.
Lola, as you were speaking, I also had Korea, Republic of Korea, and Japan in my mind's eye, and
Yeah.
Europe. But of course, in Europe, countries like Italy, like Spain, are facing the, the exact same dilemma. And yet,
Mm.
when you talk about migration, immigration in Europe, it acquires a very sharp edge to it, like in Japan. So I wonder whether these developed, advanced societies are able to see, want of a better term, the colorification of their demography, the population mix. But my question for you, and I've wanted to ask this of an expert such as yourself for a very long time, so uh, here it comes. In development studies, the discussion between empowering rural communities so that they don't become urban migrants on the margins of mega cities, it goes back a long way. And I see it amongst anthropologists, this discussion continuing, that you build small, you give them the tools, the means, the roof over their heads, and the ability to continue with anthropologists see as sustainable rural living, right? And yet those people, many of them have different aspirations. They move to cities and they create these ghettos. In terms of having your bird's eye view of this from experience of a place or more globally, how do you see these debates evolving? Have they evolved, or were you still around the same corner?
I think it's a wonderful question, and you're tempting me to get on a political soapbox here, which I will endeavor not to do. I want to keep it fact-based as much as I can. We did quite a bit of work on the broader topic of migration. So I would like to preface all this by saying I'm an unabashed fan of migration. Migration is a good thing. It is good socially, it is good economically, it is good environmentally. It enhances our cultural, social lives. It boosts our productivity. and it's often a way of fixing an environmental problem, as in like leaving it. So that's it allows you to remediate what you did. So the migration numbers, I won't get into the debate. There are some losers typically in migration when migrants show up, usually the children of the previous migrants, because the jobs that the new migrants take are typically the jobs of the children of the previous migrants because they haven't moved on. And that's why migration works. Migration is essentially a catalyst for growth. It pushes societies to create new jobs and new employment opportunities because the migrants take the other ones. And otherwise societies will stagnate. The, um, the flip side of this is it obviously comes with conflict, and it comes with conflict between the old and the new, and it comes with conflict. It comes with an increased demand on our public goods, whether it's a shared infrastructure, or schools, or sewage, or whatever. And because migrants typically don't have a lot of money, that's why they're migrating. 90% of migrants come for economic reasons. Therefore they wind up in you say they create ghettos. That's because they don't have money. Now, if we were to invest in integrating them into society, you might have a different view of migrants. But instead, if we treat them as marginalized people to be, the cost of spending on which should be reduced to the absolute minimum, well, then you get what you pay for, which is nothing. So in fact, what we see, is racism and segregation. So the debate that is largely carried out is between people who do not wish to be inconvenienced and to preserve the character of their neighborhoods by this very same people who are coming to take care of their children and provide their parents home health care. And so this is institutionalized racism, covered up as the desire for aesthetic, harmony or something. So I find that morally and economically bankrupt as a philosophy. So then finally to the rural versus urban thing, I do not have a point of view about whether a person or a given person should or should not stay in the countryside. And I have a good friend of mine who would take exactly this point of view. We would take exactly the same facts and come up with 180-degree different resolutions where, he would say, well, the way to fix this problem is to improve the quality of life in the countryside. And I say, well, the way to fix this problem is move those people in the countryside to the city, because we know that it is much, much more expensive to provide the infrastructure on which our higher quality of life, our longer life expectancy, our education, our culture is built in the countryside than in the city. And that is because cities represent density, and density gives you scale and agglomerations of demand. So it's just more expensive. So if you can afford it, or you can reduce your expectations. Gandhi was famously reported to have said, when asked, well, he was asking about some financial matter, and he said, "Why do we have so much? Why is it taking so long?" And somebody said, "Well, Gandhiji, it takes a lot of money to keep you in poverty." And I think that my friends who advocate that are, sadly, or perhaps not so sadly, in which case, let's say mischievously, unaware of the costs of their rural tranquility. So I have a fairly hard view on that, is that we should think about migrants as an asset to be invested in, and that it will have a return. But if you do not make the investment, you will have subpar performance, and that outcome is very much to the society to decide. Would they rather have subpar performance in a city, or mediocre performance in the countryside? For myself, I would say let's go for excellent performance in the cities. Let's respect what is this trajectory that's built off of migration and productivity growth and reinvestment in the public services. That is the trajectory to success for any society.
That's very powerful, Lola. I want to go a little bit further up in your bird's eye view on this, not debunking it, but we've heard a lot about microfinancing, and I'm thinking maybe the rural connectivity, they need from microfinancing to macro connectivity, and I would say perhaps fair parity in terms of life expectations in an interconnected world, because the guy who's sitting in a village is seeing things in the countryside. I remember trekking and hiking in Nepal at 3,500 meters and seeing all kinds of brands on the, rope of the t-shirts that are fake, but it shows that they understand what they're buying, whether it's a soccer football club, or a Gucci that is, on a t. So there's this element of advertising and showing a lifestyle that the urban population or the countryside would like to be involved in. So the key question I have for you is this notion of debt trap diplomacy. I know it's a big topic, but when we look at debt development ratio, how does China stack up along the BRI with the traditional institutions from World Bank, IMF, multilateral institutions in terms of what you have to show for against the outstanding share of debt? So whenever there is this, blame game from Western Hemisphere to China, or debt trap diplomacy, Anush and I have had many guests talking about it, but I think you would be at a very, how do you say, in-depth intimacy with this subject. What is this ratio of debt development between China, what China has to show against any debt that the developing countries or Global 6 may have, versus the Western Hemisphere institutions?
Well, great question. It's probably a little too early to tell because a lot of the money that China spent or has put out there has been in basically the last 15 years, maybe even last 10 years. So by any means, that's a very short time for infrastructure. Infrastructure projects typically start to show some kind of return in their second decade and actually start making a difference closer to their third or fourth. So we're a little early here. And historically, if you look at cumulative investment stocks, there's basically nowhere on the planet where China is a majority of foreign direct investment. And by cumulative standards, the British, the Dutch, and the Americans usually are in pole position when it comes to who has invested the most in this country. And if you look at those countries, you can see that that investment has resulted in their current condition. So, if they are in the Global 6, it's kind of has something to do with who was investing in them before. And so let's just leave it to that. Trevor Manuel had the South African finance minister had a wonderful speech where he noted that it was not that Africa lacked infrastructure. It just had a very specific kind of infrastructure. Well, you have what we called mine to port infrastructure. If you looked at where the railways were in Africa, they were going from the mines to the ports. Yeah. And the fact that there was any other kind of infrastructure around that was somewhat incidental. The colonial overseers would have built some kind of a city around the mine. It was called Johannesburg. And of course, there was a city at the port. And that was pretty much it, and we had the power and we had the water and the utility to support that. But, a national grid, why would you need one of those things? We're very clear as to why we built the infrastructure. And so China has come in with a slightly different perspective on all of that, in the sense that China is not particularly out there to grab the resources. Resource investment is certainly part of what they're doing. But it's no more than 15%, maybe 16, 20%. And it's very targeted. So you got some lithium, some cobalt, some aluminium. But in general, it's not about that. The majority of Chinese investment is either going pure and simple into infrastructure, so just like building roads, and about half of Chinese foreign direct investment is actually overseas labor contracts. And so people going out there with pickaxes and shovels and bulldozers, and then the rest of it is by and large private sector led. So these are Chinese entrepreneurs who are just out there selling stuff. Whether it's stainless stainless steel tubing, or wheel loaders, or Huawei selling telecom equipment, whatever. I think, and that is the untold story about the Belt and Road. Everybody positions the Belt and Road as this massive state exercise, and I'm not saying that it isn't. Of course, there is. It's China's foreign policy, basically, but the majority of the numbers, the majority of the investments not coming from the state. It is coming from individual private sector entrepreneurs from China who are saying, hey, I want to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I remember being in Kenya 25 or 30 years ago and reading in the Naivasha Times, the English language journal about Mr. Wong from Zhejiang, who had opened up a construction equipment dealership in Naivasha. And somebody went and interviewed Mr. Wong and says, why are you here? And they said they had to explain they couldn't speak to Mr. Wong in English or in Swahili for that matter, because he spoke neither of those things. And it's like, how did you get here? And he said, well, my cousin, ran a distributorship down in Mombasa. And I lost my job in Zhejiang, and he said, "Come on over, and we can open up another dealership somewhere in Naivasha or wherever." And so I did, and I settled down, and I married a local girl, and here we are. So that's the Chinese investment strategy. It's very organic, and as a result, if we look at countries where there's been a lot of Chinese investment, I think. Yes, there are, every once in a while you get a Hambantota airport or something, or, yeah, sure. But who really wants to wind up with a bankrupt, airfield? Well, I'm not sure that's the point of the strategy. But what you see moreover, and there have been some studies on this, is literally the lights are coming on. If you look from outer space at the places where China's investment has been going, they have more lights. Nighttime illumination is stronger in those places over time than where comparable amounts of aid go by Western agencies. So that's the characteristics. Now you could say maybe that's all infrastructure that doesn't need to be built because there's no economic activity. That is not the Chinese approach. The Chinese approach is like, well, either you have economic activity or you have infrastructure, but one or the other. And if you have no economic activity, then better build some infrastructure because maybe you can unlock some economic activity. But if you if you have neither, well, then we're not interested. So.
Spellbinding, Lola. I'm going to spin your head. Staying on the theme of infrastructure and such like, and to draw on your experience of China's development, as Ali alluded to, given the pace of change and what China is now exporting, I wouldn't put it strongly as a model, but as a way of change, no strongly than that. Are you aware of much thinking about clean urbanization? Again, in Europe, we hear in the US, we hear much about the impact of concrete construction on human health in dense urban environments, or about lack of greenery or open spaces and so on. The stuff that makes humans a bit more comfortable where they live. Given the pace of change in China, it probably wasn't a priority in the past, but as China has moved so much faster, can you tell us whether there has been this, step change in thinking at home that also can become something transferable overseas?
Yeah, it was about 25 years ago when I was at Tianjin Davos or something. And somebody asked the question about green, China, that question basically about, what kind of energy needs will China really have going forward? Again, it's 25 years ago. And a guy stood up from Minmetals, which is the state trading agency, and so state company. And he said, the most valuable energy that China will need is the energy that it doesn't use. So energy efficiency has to be our primary resource when it comes to energy, meeting our energy needs. We need to be better at that. I thought to myself, wow, this is the guy who's responsible for importing energy resources. And he's saying that his goal is to reduce the amount of energy imports. So well, this must definitely not be, something that's driven by his economic interest because he's basically arguing against himself. And so why? And it became very clear that, at that point, 20 to 25 years ago, it was a very radical flip. It occurred in the space of an eye, blink of an eye, which was from saying, Western imperialists are trying to hold back Chinese growth by making them, go green, and so, can't develop as fast and whatever, to China's going to be the green champion. So we're going to be more green than everybody else. And you ask yourself, why did that actually happen? And I think the answer was there was an externality associated with the development mindset that basically said, well, any point of GDP is a good point of GDP. So let's just go get it. And there were a couple of externalities in the economic context. The first one, and the one I think that drove this, was security. That China simply does not want to be the last person standing in the region. That they have no desire to be dependent on what I've always seen as a volatile and unforgiving external environment. And so in that context, anything they can do to reduce that volatility is going to be number one priority on the entire strategic agenda. And as they saw the exposure on the energy side and the resource side mounting, they realized that, whoa, we must focus on reducing that exposure. We need to do that. So that was the number one thing. Number two thing became about 10 years later, there was a movie called Under the Dome, which I have to give credit to, first of all, to the US government. The US government's single most effective intervention in China's public policy, other than perhaps WTO accession, was the U.S. consulate at one point in the early 2000s started to send out text to its employees to say, today's a bad air day. The AQI is very high. You should wear some masks. And then these texts got picked up by Chinese citizens who then sort of started to broadcast them. And this created this whole awareness of the fact that we were all literally choking. And the government was denying it for their part. I mean, being good communists, and it's like, no, 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 it's not happening. And it's like, wait a second, I can taste it. And so finally, this reporter came out with this movie, Under the Dome, which was viewed, but even had an endorsement from the Minister of the Environment, which had just been created. And it was downloaded by 20 million times, and then they shut it down. And then, anyway, it became too hard to hide. So at that moment, the Xi Jinping is 2010. So he said to declare, okay, war on pollution. So so air pollution became a thing, and that was overnight again. So and then finally we've had a generation of urban development professionals who have very much adopted what you have been saying about the need for green space. And so I live in a city that believes in this, and so we have expanded our green space per capita and doubled it or tripled it. It's arguably the best city in the world, I think. But that's that's the story. It is a transition that happens sometimes stochastically because of the recognition of an externality. Sometimes it's simply, as I said, with the green space, more of a product of like, well, as we get more desires, we mount our hierarchy of Maslowian needs. We now put more expectations in on our development path. So yeah.
Lola, I can go on forever. I'm sure Anush the same, but we're mindful of your time being in Shanghai. I have two questions. I packed them together. My first question is, how long do you think the Global Six can be pushed or coerced by America that, hey, don't use Huawei, don't use ZTE, don't use this service provider because they're maybe in bed with government of China. Whereas when you look at the other side, you look at Alphabet, you look at Google, you look at Microsoft, Amazon, Palantir, they're all in the same, business or relationships. And how long can America, keep this as a lever? And when you look at the infrastructure projects, HS2, Hinkley, everything in London as well somehow has been, pushed out the Chinese contractors based on security. So the development and security balance. And the last question I have for you, which we ask all of our guests to generously leave what do you call a nugget of wisdom. What is your single most, and I think in your case it's the most important one. I have to say that, Anush, having lived all these years in China, what is the most important piece of advice that you would give to cinephobes and cinephiles?
Okay, sure. Um, I first of all wanted to thank both of you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I enjoyed the soapbox. So thanks for giving me a chance to get on it. The Well, I think we're already there. I mean, as far as, this multipolar world is concerned, that I do not see the capacity of any player, let alone, whether it's the US or China or anyone, to unilaterally exert influence. That it is a more a matter of on a specific time in a specific place in a specific issue, an individual country may choose to spend its chips on that kind of thing. But no one is that far ahead of anybody else that they can truly establish what we'll call a global regime. The era of Pax Americana, which I tremendously benefited from, but is at a definitive end. And I think we're moving back into something which is much more familiar to the vast majority of us, which is a contested terrain.
Mhm.
So, and that, goes as true for the Global Six as anyone else, that they all need to figure out, how they're going to play this. And I think there are a lot of archetypes, and I would not presume to speak on behalf of any particular one. I know that most folks are looking out for their own interests. In the words of Lee Hsien Loong, the former senior minister of Singapore, when asked what is the most appropriate global governance framework in this new time, he says, "Well, I suppose," and with a twinkle in his eye, the world minus one temporarily. So, well, we all must go on with our lives. We need trade, they need trade, we all need trade. And if one player doesn't really want to participate, well, I guess okay. That's we will have to live with that. But in the meantime, we go on, and there are needs to improve the existing multilateral organizations, and dispute resolution mechanisms to be improved, and a whole bunch of other things.
Right.
But the world without interconnection, or the world without trade, is a much poorer world, and in that context, I don't think it's actually possible to envision that. So, which goes for China too. So let's just keep an eye on that. And finally, as to the advice, my most important word of advice to the folks who have strongly held opinions about China without having been to China is to go to China. So that it's generally speaking visa free, and it is a relatively cheap plane flight away. So, I mean, yes, China is a full body experience. Please visit, and you will be treated well. You will eat wonderful Chinese food. It will be very safe, and you will experience a context which you are not familiar with. So, and I would probably give the same advice to Chinese folks who have strongly held opinions about the West, is that, if they believe something is true about America based on reading some Chinese media, probably they should go to America. But they should be very careful when they do, because yes, I am American, and I understand my country. So, and I'm afraid that the general, this will be a bit of a shock for most of my Chinese colleagues. But they should go so they can understand it, and they should try to really understand the dynamism that characterize Western society. I am not a pessimist about Western society. I believe it has its own pattern, its own rhyme and reason, and that's different from China. And it's definitely a lot more chaotic and volatile in its own way, but it has a dynamic, and it would be helpful for China to understand that. So,
Uh, Spellbinding, Lola, and so rich with wisdom and commentary. By the way, whoever comes to China must start in Shanghai, I have to say.
Shanghai is my city. I think Shanghai
It is an
is
extraordinary place and a very enjoyable place for all the reasons and more that you've already alluded to. Lola, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as our guest. spellbinding, riveting, educational, insightful, everything that can be said. I keep up the amazing work that you're doing, and we would love to come and see you in China. Actually, we won't want you as a guest here. Ali and I will come to Shanghai and record it in person with
I
you.
think that's a much better idea. We have excellent facilities.
Our Prime Minister has just negotiated visa-free travel to China for us, so
Yeah.
we Brits can come and
And,
enjoy.
and you have approved the embassy. So isn't that a coincidence?
Indeed. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as our guest. Thank you so much, Lola.
Lola, I want to
My pleasure.
thank you as well. You talked a lot about nighttime illumination. This was a fantastic daylight illumination. So thank you for that. And we will use Global 6 in all of our future communications.
I'm amazed. Thank you so much. My pleasure. Okay.